Now, breaking news this morning as official figures have been released on this year's A-level results, with figures showing that 79% of UK 18-year-old applicants have got the grades needed to get a place at their first choice university.
But that compares to last year's, which was 81%. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning,
thanks
Charlotte.
for joining us this morning. Obviously, a big day for students up and down the country. Now, you had warned them about the fact that they were going to face harsher marking because of this rebalancing that had to do. Do you think it's premature, though, because there are going to be those who've put in so much hard work? They still face the impact of the pandemic. You know, a lot of them hadn't even done proper exams until this stage, and they had the teacher strikes on top of all that as well. Has it been fair to them, do you think?
Well, the most important thing is that they've done a brilliant job. I mean, congratulations to all of them. As you said, they've had a lot to deal with, they've had a lot to put up with. They've shown their resilience. And the reason we're doing this is to make sure that the qualifications that they're taking hold value. I mean, both A-levels and GCSEs are very highly regarded qualifications around the world, actually. But they need to hold value. And so what we've decided to do, or Ofqual actually made the decision, is to go back to the 2019 grade. So if you got an A or a B in 2019, then that will be, the intention is that will be exactly the same this year. And everybody knows, the university admissions officers knows, the people giving the offers know, everybody knows that this is what we chose to do. We announced it 2 years ago. So the system is right that it adapts to that. But we had to do it at some point. This cohort have done amazingly well. And as you just said from the UCAS figures, yes, the 79% have got their first choice, their firm choice, and another 12% have got their insurance choice, which is actually much better than 2019 cohort.
But, it still points to the fact that they are still suffering the consequences, aren't they? And of course, everybody knows that there's going to have to be a rebalancing at some point. But for those students, you say the most important thing is that they've done a brilliant job. If they're sitting there now thinking, well, actually, no, the most important thing is that I can get to where I need to get to, whether that's my place at the university I want to go to, whether that's a job with an employer. What do you say to those students who are now facing an anxious wait at clearing? They've got a whole process to go through at that. They're going to an employer who perhaps doesn't understand the whole system with this rebalancing. And this is their futures we're talking about, isn't it?
Well, we have made sure that also employers do know as well. So Ofqual have been working with employers to make sure they understand. So there is 9% of young people in clearing. There's 29,000 courses. There's also 8,500 apprenticeships, which are a newer addition to the scheme. And we've put apprenticeships on UCAS now, and there was 3 million clicks, searches on the apprenticeships, and about 350,000 that clicked through to look at those options. Now, as somebody who did a degree apprenticeship myself, as you know, I've been a big advocate for this route as well. And there's these options there's more destinations and options open to young people than ever before. And I think the thing that was brilliant about the results as well is the number of kids on free school meals places, 16,500 getting a place in university, which is up 60% on 2019 figures. And we've done a lot of work and still have more to do to close that disadvantage gap. But you are more likely to go to university now if you're from that background than you ever have before.
Because I've been looking at figures that say it's the disadvantaged that are going to be bearing the brunt of this grade deflation most. A survey of students by the Social Mobility Foundation found those from disadvantaged or low-income backgrounds in England are less likely to have received the help they needed to restore the learning that was lost during the pandemic. So actually, we're getting a bigger gap there for the disadvantaged students. They're missing out and being punished as a consequence of what they've had to go through.
Well, we did have £5 billion, which we've put into catch-up funding. But it's right that that disadvantage gap has grown under the pandemic. Under this government from 2010, we had closed that gap for the first time by 9.1%. So we were really pleased with the progress from 2010 to 2019. But it has stepped back with the pandemic, which is why we put that £5 billion extra to help with tutoring, to help with catch-up, etc. But of course, actually what we saw in the teacher assessed grades, it was actually the disadvantaged children that lost out in the teacher assessed grades as well. So the fairest way of assessing young people is definitely exams. Everybody takes the same exam in the same conditions at the same time. And of course, that is where you get to show what you know. But of course, we are really focused on making sure that we close that disadvantage gap. And it's really good news for, that your chance now of going to university, if you're from a disadvantaged background, you're 86% more likely to go to university than you were in 2010. So it's not an arbitrary figure like 50%. It's very targeted on making sure that we do give that access to university.
Gillian Keegan, you say 2010. That was 13 years ago. That was when you've been in power. You've been in power for 13 years. Why are you now, 13 years later, still saying to us on national television that we are reducing the gap? We are still trying. You've been in power for 13 years. What have you been doing for the last 12 years?
Well, for the 12 of those years, we were reducing it by 9.1%, which is the figure I gave you. So that was from 2010 up to 2019, so for 9 of those years. Then, obviously, the pandemic struck, and obviously we had to... I mean, in the pandemic, we were delivering 1.95 million laptops to disadvantaged kids so that they could get access to education, etc. So, obviously, the pandemic had a bit of an impact on that. But for the 13 years that, we've been in power, for the pre-pandemic, we were making more progress than any government has ever made. And these are long-standing issues. Somebody who grew up in Knowsley, it is one of these areas that has a lot of disadvantage. So, I went to school there 35 years ago. I'm fully aware of the disadvantage gap and how stubborn it is and how difficult it is to move. But this government, in that period, did more than anybody has ever done in the past.
Just to point out, when you say that you've been putting more money over the last few years, you've had to because there's been more students. So actually, if you do it per student, it's no higher than the levels before 2010, and a lot of fact-check websites are saying that. So make that very clear.
Actually, I do have a great deal of... I look at these figures, and I'm a businesswoman by training, so I look at these figures in great detail. Next year, we'll be spending nearly £60 billion on our education system, and that is nearly £3 billion more per year than when I first got the job, which was only in October 2025.
So there has been seeing an increase in students, though, aren't we? We're seeing an increase in students. So, yes, you might be putting more money in, but that's because we're also seeing an increase of students. So it's not necessarily more money. It's the same money, but just for more an increased number of students.
Well, there's different budgets that look at the demographics, which is one aspect of it, the new buildings we need, which is another aspect of it. But the money that we've increased in recent years has been for pay rises and also for the inflationary pressures and also last year's pay rises. But £60 billion, no matter which way you measure it, back to per pupil, back in real terms increases, no matter which way you measure it, is more than we've ever spent on our schools in history.
OK. Can I ask you something, a different matter, but I promised myself that I would bring this up when I come back to Good Morning Britain and speaking to somebody from the government. It was disappointing for lots of us to hear the Deputy Chairman's comments only a week ago about the migrant crisis, when he said that if migrants don't like the barges, they can, and I can't use the words because Ofcom will get me into trouble, use an expletive, they can go back to France. Now, as the Secretary of State for Education, if a student said that to another student in a playground at a school or in university or in a college, what would you expect to happen? Should they be expelled from that school for turning around to another student? If you don't like it here, you can go back to France, you can go back to Pakistan, you can go back to Somalia. Is that kind of language acceptable in a school playground?
Well, schools have their own policies and they would basically be very, very concerned about somebody who is individually targeting somebody from a different to race, individually in the classroom. But they have their own policies, and I would trust that schools would do the best things to discipline children.
What would you say the best thing would be for a student if they did turn around to a group of students, to a race, to a group, to say, if you don't like it here, you can go back to France? What would be the best policy for a school to take?
Well, schools have bullying policies and anti-bullying policies which would make sure that they know that that's not the right thing to say, so they wouldn't say that.
So has the Conservative Party got anti-bullying policies? Has someone spoken to the Deputy Chair? He's the Deputy Chair. He's not just some MP in a constituency. He's the Deputy Chair of your party. Has somebody spoken to him about the bullying policies at the Conservative Party?
So what he was talking about specifically was a group of people who were offered a place on a barge on the Bibby Stockholm. So he was talking about a group of individuals who'd been offered that place and said they didn't want the place, so they were turning down the place that had been offered them, which was a decent place, which was, you know, a perfectly reasonable place.
Is the language? It seems to me you're saying the language is acceptable.
I haven't said anything about the language. It's not the language I would use.
Why can't you just say to me then that actually that language is unacceptable and you would not support it and you don't want to hear any students in school saying it? Because surely that's the comment. Nobody wants to say that to anybody, do they?
It's not the language I would use, and I think swearing is probably, you know, it's more for adults than for children, for sure. So children shouldn't be swearing in school, and I think most schools would probably try to stop them from doing that. But of course, as adults, we get to choose our own language.
OK. We will have to leave it there. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.